Hello. In this video, we discuss early positive school perspectives of criminality. This is the first chapter of two chapters talking about positive school perspectives of criminality. You will find that both of these chapters will discuss a theoretical perspective that essentially argues that biological and physiological differences exist between people who engage in crime and those who do not engage in crime. The primary assumptions guiding this perspective is that individuals have genetically and biologically linked characteristics that predispose them to criminal behavior. Now, similar to the perspective that we discussed when we talked about your early classical theories and modern classical theories, you'll see that this perspective developed over time and started off on really basic, but evolved over time to become extremely complex. And I'll explain why that is. However, first, as we discuss the early positive school theories, I want you to know that they began in the early to mid 1800s. And it's important to think about that when you think about these different theoretical perspectives, because a lot of times what was happening during that time period oftentimes played a significant role in shaping that perspective. This belief or this group of theories argue that there were variations across individuals in terms of their physical and physiological makeups. This belief was based on craniometry, which is essentially the study of the shape of the skull, and phrenology, which is the study of the brain. The intellectual leader of this perspective was Cesare Lombroso, who lived between 1835 and 1909. He is credited as being the father of positive criminology. He essentially observed physical characteristics of Italian prisoners that he was working with at the time. And based on his observations of these prisoners, he drew conclusions that prisoners are physiologically and biologically different from law-abiding people. Much of Lombroso's ideas were based on Darwin's theory of natural evolution and natural selection. Many of you have probably heard of Darwin before. If you've ever seen someone walking down the street and they have a picture of um, basically an ape, and then next to that picture there's a shape of an ape that is slowly starting to transform into a man, that is essentially based on Darwin's theory of evolution. Remember, Darwin argued that men essentially evolved from monkeys. He was a trained medical doctor, and he believed that most people evolved from monkeys into what you know as current day man. However, that there were some groups of people who did not fully evolve from ape. And because of that, those individuals that did not fully evolve, Lombroso argued that these people had not been selected naturally to rule over others. Much of Lombroso's ideas and his arguments, by current day standards, were classified as being racist and xenophobic, because essentially what he was arguing is that only those people who were classified as white had fully evolved, whereas those individuals who were classified as non-white had not fully evolved from ape. And those individuals who had not fully evolved from apes, Lombroso argued, were criminaloids. Those people who did not fully evolve were known as born criminals because they were most likely to engage in the most serious and violent crimes in society, whereas those individuals who had even fully evolved were known as criminaloids. Lombroso wrote a text a book called The Criminal Man in 1876. And he brought together three pre-Darwinian theories around craniology, phrenology, and physiognomy. Lombroso again essentially argued that some people suffered from what he called atavism. And atavism is defined as a person who a feature of an individual who is a throwback to an early stage of evolutionary development. Essentially, that is a person who had not fully evolved from ape. These individuals, rather than evolve, Lombroso argued, had instead devolved in the opposite direction towards primitive apes. And Lombroso argued that the way that you can tell whether or not a person is suffering from atavism is through your physical observations of these individuals. In other words, people who are atavistic and had not fully evolved from ape had physical characteristics that could be observed with the naked eye. Lombroso called these physical characteristics stigmata, and his list of stigmata varied over time. Here are a few examples of these physical characteristics or the stigmata that Lombroso argued could be observed in people who are criminals. Criminals, according to Lombroso, had asymmetrical faces, which essentially means that though their faces did not match up on each side, ideally we would think that individuals, if you were to cut their faces in half, that each side would match each other. But Lombroso argued that criminals had asymmetrical faces. They also had large monkey-like ears, large lips, receding chins, twisted noses, long arms, and skin wrinkles. And again, if you really look at these characteristics, and this is not an exhaustive list, mind you, but if you look at these characteristics, many people argue that these characteristics could be identifiable or attributed to people who are now classified as Black. So, for example, large monkey-like ears or large lips, all were traits that were known to be more likely to be found in people who are classified as Black. Based on the subtext or the underlying racist biases in Lombroso's argument, his theory was widely rejected then and is currently now rejected today. Nevertheless, Lombroso is still known as the father of criminology and the father of the positivist school of criminology because he was the first to begin to attribute criminal behavior to things beyond free will and decision making, and instead begin to look at those factors that were beyond an individual's control as being responsible for criminal behavior. This idea is called determinism, which says that human behavior is determined by factors beyond free will and free choice. Now, Lombroso's ideas have several policy implications. Although his ideas today are seen are labeled as ludicrous and unrealistic, many people believe that Lombroso's ideas during his time were actually legitimate ideas. And because of that, Lombroso was called to testify about whether individuals exhibited the visible stigmata that he listed in his list of physical traits of criminals. He was even called to identify children based on observed stigmata and make predictions about the children's life or their development moving forward. And then you can see here's even more stigmata. So for example, if he saw a child who had no earlobes or their earlobes were attached to their faces as opposed to being loose from their faces, then Lombroso was likely to label those children as being highly at risk to engage in criminal behavior. And then also, to have a furrowed tongue or a tongue that was deformed. This, according to Lombroso, suggested that this person was atavistic and likely to engage in criminal behavior. Lombroso's ideas about physical differences between criminals and non-criminals was accepted by many people. And people began to also come up with other physical characteristics that they believe that were shared by those individuals who engaged in crime. So, for example, a man named Binet in France developed what is called the IQ. We know that the IQ stands for the intelligent quotient. He identified or created the IQ to identify youth who were not performing well in school. And Binet believed that even if a child at an early age had a low IQ, with help and assistance, that child could improve upon their IQ. However, as the idea of the IQ was shared with other individuals, a man by the name of H. Goddard in the United States interpreted the IQ differently than Binet did. Contrary to Binet, Goddard argued that the IQ was static. And what I mean by static is that the IQ does not change, and that once a person has a low IQ, no matter what kind of help you give them, no matter what kind of training you give them, they can't improve upon their IQ. Goddard also argued that IQ was heritable, meaning that it was passed down from generation to generation. And so a person who has a low IQ having a child would then transmit that low IQ to that child. Goddard labeled individuals who had low IQs as feeble-minded. And this was actually a diagnosis that could be found and used and diagnose people with the condition of being feeble-minded. In addition to diagnosing individuals as being feeble-minded, people were also diagnosed as being morons, imbeciles, idiots, other diagnoses. So Goddard argued then that the biggest threat to humanity was not the idiots, but the morons, right? If you can see the definitions that are listed here on your screen, the idiots were the lowest intelligence group, followed by the imbeciles and then the morons. Goddard argued that the biggest threat would be the morons because the morons had low intelligence, but just enough intelligence to engage in criminal behavior, to formulate criminal intent. Whereas the idiots, who were the lowest intelligence group, weren't intelligent enough to engage in crime. The worry then is that, again, an individual who is feeble-minded, whether they be a moron, imbecile, or idiot, could reproduce and spread along their genes and low IQ to their offspring. Similar to Lombroso, Goddard was seen as an expert in the area of IQ, and the policy implication associated with Goddard's ideas about low IQs advocated for the use of eugenics as a policy. We know that eugenics is essentially forced sterilization so that individuals cannot reproduce. Goddard was in charge of identifying feeble-minded people at Ellis Island, and we know that during the early 1900s, when immigrants first came to the United States, they had to first pass through Ellis Island before they were allowed to be admitted into the country. Goddard was given the authority to reject individuals based on physical characteristics that he believed indicated that they had low IQs and therefore were undeserving of reproducing. Many deportations occurred based on diagnoses of feeble-mindedness that were authorized by H. Goddard. Another early positivist theory was Sheldon's body type theory. He created what is called the theory of somatotyping. And somatotyping is a fancy word for body type. According to Sheldon, criminals criminals personality characteristics could be matched with their body type. He argued that there are three body types, and he based his body types based on the layers of skin that we have, which are the endoderm, mesoderm, and ectoderm levels of our skin. According to Sheldon, there are three body types. The first body type, according to Sheldon, is what's called the endomorph. The endomorph has physical traits of a soft body, underdeveloped muscles, a round shape, overdeveloped digestive system, and along with those physical characteristics, they also had associated personality traits of the love of food, tolerance, evenness of emotions, love of comfort, sociability, good humor, relaxed mood, and need for affection. The second body type Sheldon identified was the mesomorph. The mesomorph had physical traits of being hard, muscular body, overly mature appearance, rectangular shape, thick skin, upright posture. They had the personality traits of love of adventure, desire for power and dominance, courage, indifference to what others think or want, assertive, boldness, zest for physical activity, competitive nature, and love of risk and chance. And then finally, the last body type that Sheldon identified was what is called the ectomorph body type. This physical traits of an ectomorph were thin, flat chest, delicate build, young appearance, light, muscling, stooped shoulders, large brain, and then the associated personality traits of an ectomorph were self-consciousness, preference for privacy, introversion, inhibition, social anxiety, artistic inclination, mental intensity, and emotional restraint. According to Sheldon, of these three body types, again, those body types would be the endomorph, mesomorph, and ectomorph. The mesomorph was the most likely to engage in crime. Again, this was the body type that was muscular in shape, but then had personality traits that included aggressiveness, love for power, and dominance, and indifference to what others think or want. Many people argue that Sheldon's body type theory, by today's standards, was incredibly simplistic. They also argue that just as Sheldon identified that many criminals were muscular, there are also criminals that are thin, like the ectomorph, and those who are overweight, like the endomorph. These early positivist theories gave life to several policy implications. Medical screenings at birth for physical defects, same-sex courses for children in school. So, for example, there have been studies that have found that females tend to do worse in math class than males, and males tend to do worse in English classes than females. This is specifically true when these classes have co-ed classes. However, studies have found that if you place all females in a math class and all males in the English class, they tend to do better without the opposite gender in the class. And so because of that, there have been some schools that have designated their math and English classes this way. Another policy implication that came out of these perspectives was IQ testing and aptitude testing of children for the purposes of providing early intervention. And then lastly, screening for toxins in children's bloodstreams to prevent any type of physical abnormalities that may lead to criminal behavior. Essentially, these perspectives or these early theories of positivist theories argue that there are physical traits that one can identify by simply looking at people. And based on these traits that you observe, you then could predict whether or not individuals would engage in crime. Next week, we'll talk about your more modern biological theories. However, these are your early positivist theories of criminal behavior. Please read your textbook, and then I'll see you next week.